Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. Our guest this week, Isla Myers-Smith, has been studying Arctic shrubs to find out how warming climate impacts the plants. This work involves collecting data from drones and satellites, for which Isla and her colleagues created a drone network called HiLDEN. Uni courses, of course, don't really prepare you for that kind of technical expertise, and Isla had to acquire her coding skills largely self-taught, like many of us. But today she's a fellow of the Software Sustainability Institute and also helps others ramping up their skills, so they are better prepared for a future in science and research. But back to shrubs and drones. Here now my conversation with Isla. Hello Isla, welcome to the show and thank you very much for your time today. Before we start going into drones and ecology and other exciting things that you're working on, maybe you can briefly introduce yourself.
I'm Isla Myers-Smith from the University of Edinburgh, and I tend to call myself a global change ecologist. And a lot of my work happens in tundra ecosystems, so north of the tree line and up at the top of mountains.
Well, that sounds exciting. Exactly the next question that I have for you, which is because you've been, as you said, studying the tundra willow extensively. What makes these plants so special in your eye?
I work in these ecosystems where there are no trees, so it's too cold. The summers are too short. The temperatures are too cold, both in summer and too harsh in winter for trees to grow. But as we know, the climate is changing up north, and it's changing in the Arctic much more rapidly than around the rest of the planet. One of the species that's responding really well to those warmer conditions are shrubs. So they're kind of the trees of the tundra. They're plants with woody stems that tend to grow quite slowly, but grow more in warmer summers. And so we're seeing this change at sites around the tundra biome where the shrubs are increasing within these landscapes. So both places where there wasn't vegetation, different plants are coming in, including these shrubs. And then where there were plants growing, the shrubs are becoming more dominant.
So it's telling us something about the climate change then, depending on where they grow and how far they grow and how fast they grow, or how can I envisage that?
So one of the cool things about all woody plants growing in ecosystems where the climate changes is that you get this record of the growth. So you get tree rings, or in this case, shrub rings. In the summertime, when the plants are growing faster, their wood grows quite rapidly, and it's a lighter color, and the little pores in the wood are larger. And then when winter comes, the growth slows down and then eventually stops, and you get this dense wood that's a darker color. And so when, I don't know, if you've made a log fire or something and you've chopped wood, you'll see those rings in the wood, and you can use that to age that stem. And you can also look at the width of those growth rings, and that tells you something about how much that plant grew in the year in which that growth happens. You can go back through time and figure out how these plants have grown.
You and your team have done a tundra willow common garden experiment. And I'd like to find out a little bit more about it because getting excited about shrubs. So I have a garden in London. I use shrubs as a decorative thing, but obviously using it for science. So how was this experiment set up?
So we call that site the Common Garden, and it sounds like it's this beautiful place. It is quite a beautiful place, but
in different ways.
a little more utilitarian than your average garden. So I'll just sort of bring you to the place with words. So it's out on the edge of this lake called Kluane Lake in the Yukon Territory. And it's surrounded by the boreal forest. So there's trees around, and we picked the site for its convenient location, but in part because it has a lovely mountain view. So when you're working in the garden doing tedious things, you can look up and see this sort of panoramic view of mountains. And what we've done is divide out this area into different plots. And in the plots, we've been planting the stems of willows from two sites, one 1,000 kilometers to the north in Arctic tundra, and the other general set of sites are up mountains, about 1,000 meters up the mountain in the same region. So you have local willows growing at the tops of mountains in alpine tundra, and Arctic willows growing 1,000 kilometers to the north in Arctic tundra, the same species. And then we brought them together in this warmer common environment. And this is a way to sort of test the question, how do these plants respond when the conditions warm up beyond what they've currently experienced?
So how do the plants respond then?
What we've seen, so we established the experiment in 2013, and the results are in, though we haven't yet published them. So this is exciting, hot off the press work. We find that those alpine willows grow really rapidly in this warmer environment. And so when we planted them initially, they were 10, 20 centimeters off the ground. And now some of those individuals are a meter, meter and a half. These are plants that in their alpine tundra environments would be growing only a couple centimeters a year, and down in this warmer environment they can grow up to 20 centimeters a year. So it's a much more rapid growth than they would otherwise experience. And those Arctic willows are happy to grow in this common warmer environment, but they're still growing at a much slower rate in general. So this is the case for 2 of the 3 species we've looked at. So the Arctic willows stay small, the alpine willows get bigger than this growth that we see in the alpine environment. And then there's another difference that we see, which is that the Arctic willows and the alpine willows start growing at around the same time, but the Arctic willows, their leaves turn yellow in the middle of the summer. So they start to go into senescence. Autumn comes for those willows in the middle of the summer, whereas the alpine willows keep growing and are quite happy and green into August, which is the beginning of autumn when you're up north. And so what we think is going on there is that the Arctic willows are adapted to different light conditions. And so they're picking up the signals of winter coming in the middle of the summer rather than more towards the end of the summer because they've been moved 1,000 kilometers south. And those alpine willows have the same light conditions because they've only moved down the mountain slopes. And so they can keep growing in the normal way they would otherwise grow. So an adaptation to light conditions as well as potential ability to respond to climate. But I talked about how there's 3 species in that garden. So that's how 2 of the species respond. And the third species, which is interestingly the willow species that's found most broadly around the world, a tundra willow species, and this is a species called Salix arctica. Arctic, also found in
a hint in the name, yeah.
And it's a species that can't grow tall. So it's a dwarf willow species. So it grows along the ground. But we brought those Arctic willows, Arctic Salix arctica, that's confusing, down 1,000 kilometers, and we brought them down from the mountains, and they grow about the same. So both the Arctic and the alpine willows are perfectly happy for that species. And interestingly, that's the species that grows the farthest north, perhaps has adaptations to climate that allow it to persist and thrive in warmer conditions and colder conditions. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem so tied into the same differences in the light signal. So for Salix arctica, perfectly happy in a boreal forest environment, which we didn't expect because it's the one that should be, because it grows the farthest north, it should be the most stressed out by those warmer conditions. Whereas the other 2 species did have this difference in growth, with the Arctic willows growing more slowly than the alpine willows.
What does it tell us about climate change, that some plants are being replaced as the climate gets warmer? Or how do you measure the impact from your results in terms of climate change?
I'll combine what we found from our observational studies when we go to different sites around the Arctic, and we found this general increase in shrub species with what we're seeing in that common garden experiment. Here's what I think is going on, but I think there's more work to do. Number one, these shrubs, I think we're relatively confident about this finding. They are climate sensitive. So they respond to changing climate conditions. When things warm up, they grow more. But I think the common garden experiment has taught us that different species will respond in different ways, and not necessarily the ways we would predict. So we've talked a lot about in the climate change literature, both within the Arctic, but also more broadly in different studies, that species that are found in colder environments should be more or less climate sensitive. So as things warm, we might expect the species from the really cold places to not do as well because the environment gets warmer and other plants might start doing well. But we, I think, found a bit of a surprise in that common garden experiment where the species that is found in those colder climates is actually responding well to the warmer conditions. So I think there are some surprises in store, would be my guess, with our predictions and observations of how climate change impacts will play out with tundra plants, but perhaps more broadly that, maybe sometimes our assumptions of which species should be kind of the winners under climate change and which species will be the losers, we can get it wrong without testing how things really respond.
So we can't really predict what the exact impact will be if the temperatures go further up than they already did in terms of species and their survival.
I think we can try to make predictions, but we should always maintain that uncertainty about those predictions. And I think one of the critical things we kind of need to keep adding into our studies is these kind of experiments that take things outside of the climate envelope that those species have previously experienced and bring them into even warmer climates. You need that to make a more meaningful prediction. Right now, the Arctic as a whole has warmed by about 2 degrees, and the projections for sort of climate change go up to maybe 10 degrees of warming by 2100. Those are temperatures that the current plants have never experienced before. So if we want to know what those plants will do when it gets that warm, we have to think of creative ways to actually expose those tundra ecosystems to that level of warmth and see what happens.
You're also the founder of HiLDEN, and I'm reading that now from my notes. It's the High Latitude Drone Ecology Network. First of all, can you describe what the network is and what it does?
Yeah, so a few years ago, I got grant funded to study tundra vegetation change. And it was at the time when drones were just becoming something that more of us could access. They were starting to be sort of sold in your local store, at least kits to build drones. Yeah. And so suddenly there was this tool that was available to scientists that we hadn't had easy access to before. The full story is I had originally submitted the grant without any drones, just sort of straight up plant ecology, measuring tapes and plots and monitoring over time, and didn't get funded. And so one of my colleagues was like, you know what, you should just throw some drones in there. So I was like, okay. And I wrote in this proposal all about how I was going to start to use drones to monitor tundra vegetation change, not having ever flown a drone before or really knowing what that would involve. Sure enough, the project gets funded. And so then I had this little moment of, oh no, what have I done? I'm going to have to learn how to be a drone ecologist, someone who can actually use these tools, these new tools. So there was a steep learning curve for myself and my research group. In the early days, we would build our own drone platforms and things would go wrong in the summer and you're out there in the middle of the Arctic tinkering away with no access to the internet, trying to get these drones back up and flying when one wire comes undone. But over successive years, we got more comfortable with what we were doing. And at the same time, the drone technology became more and more off the shelf. And so it basically brought drones into our sort of regular ecological monitoring that we do when we do fieldwork. And as that was happening, we knew that other groups working at sites around the Arctic and in northern ecosystems were also bringing these same tools with them. But we also knew there wasn't a lot of coordination. So people would bring the same drones, but they wouldn't necessarily be collecting the same kinds of data with them. We're sort of thinking ahead and thinking it'd be really cool to synthesize this drone data from sites around the Arctic and to really get at that question of linking what we see on the ground when we're going out as field ecologists with what satellites see from space of the change that's going on in these systems. But if we really want to compare those data sets, we need to make sure people are using common protocols. So they're flying the drones at the same elevation, recording what platform they're using, what sensor, what the environmental conditions are, what the cloud conditions are like, what the wind is like, so that when we put all the data together, we at least know, hopefully we're comparing apples with apples mostly, or if we're comparing apples with oranges, we know how those different data sets differ. So we started to get the different people we knew working with drones communicating with each other. And then we wrote up some pretty easy to implement protocols. And that was sort of the founding of the network. And now we're trying to work on that first paper with this pretty impressive data set. So I think we have around 70 sites around the Arctic with high resolution drone data, and we've extracted satellite data for these sites, and we're looking at these trends in the spectral greening of these landscapes using the relatively simple sensors on these satellites to try and infer vegetation change or the greenness of the land surface and how that might be changing, and then linking it down to what you can see with a really high resolution drone about the actual change going on. You can, in these drone data sets, see the individual plants, see other kinds of disturbances like permafrost disturbances that are changing that greenness signal that's all masked within what the satellites see because the resolution of the data is so much larger.
So how can we envisage that you take kind of an area and you fly a little lower and then you pick out and take some images and measure how plants are being damaged, or can they automatically detect if they're damaged?
Maybe I should go back a step before I answer that question and go back to sort of the why. So we were talking earlier about climate change and how rapidly it's happening in the Arctic. And one of the other sort of big signals of change comes from these satellite data sets. And it is this sort of greening trend at many sites around the Arctic. So you see this increase in these greenness indexes that we think represent plants on the ground. But in some sites, we see instead of the greenness going up over time, we see the greenness decreasing over time. And so we call that browning. 20 to 40% of the sites we look at, you get this greening signal, and around 5 to 10% of the sites we look at, you get browning signal. And then the rest of the sites, we're seeing some sort of no directional change signal from the satellite data. And then on the ground, from our sort of plot-based monitoring or our shrub studies looking at the dendroecology, we know that vegetation is increasing, that areas that were bare ground are becoming vegetated at many sites. But we only have the sort of focal sites that people visit. That's where we have information for. But with the satellite data, we have information for the entire tundra biome. Maybe we study places where more vegetation change is going on, just by chance, or because those are sites that are more impacted in some way. And maybe the satellite data is more representative of the change that's going on. Or the other side of the coin is maybe satellites are missing some of the information going on the ground because their data are so coarse. So some of the satellite platforms that have been used in these Arctic greening studies have pixel sizes that are about 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers. So
it's quite a wide range.
That's big. There's a lot of change going on. And then some of the satellite data sets have pixels that are more like 500 meters by 500 meters. And then as you come down in size, there's some satellite data sets where it's 30 meters by 30 meters. So starting to get down to the size where you can see real change going on the ground. But still, the plants that we're talking about are less than a meter by meter size. So you're missing a lot of the resolution that you might need to figure out the change that's going on. And I'll give you one example of a type of change that we think is going on in the Arctic that satellites might, if we infer this greening signal as meaning just vegetation change, that might be a bit of a misinterpretation. The Arctic's a pretty cold place. It snows a lot in the wintertime, and then in the summertime, that snow melts. As things are getting warmer, that snow melt can happen earlier. In a lot of the Arctic, you have variation in topography, and so snow accumulates in the lows of the landscape. So you get these sort of deep snow patches. And as the summer progresses, the ridges, the snow will melt off there. And then you'll have this patch of snow that can last pretty late into the season. Sometimes those snow patches last all year round. But in many sites, they'll melt out sometime in July or the middle of the summer. As things are melting earlier, those snow patches are melting out earlier in the summer. A snow patch that used to be there by the end of July now disappears in the middle of July. Snow is white. Underneath that snow might still be plants. So when the snow is gone, from a satellite perspective, that'll look like a greening because now there's more green tundra exposed in July than there had been previously. And the white patches really, from a satellite perspective, look not very green. They look very, very white. So this change in the amount of snow that would be in a landscape at any point in the summer could create a greening signal without the plants themselves having to have changed at all.
Yeah, right.
So that's one example of a thing that our high-resolution drone data can pick up because they can see those small snow patches within the landscape and help us to interpret, okay, so this pixel has shown a lot of greening, but we know there's a big snow patch in it. And then maybe at another site, we would see a big permafrost disturbance that's formed over the last 20 years. And that's a site maybe where we see the spectral browning, the decrease in greenness. And then we can be like, well, that's probably due to this disturbance on the landscape at this point, et cetera. So we can start to isolate the mechanism by just having one time point of high resolution data and then interpret what the satellite sees.
All right, so it's in collaboration or in conjunction with satellite data. So it's not only by themselves that we can envisage that. So you told me before the recording started that you're going on a field study. Can you tell us more about that?
My research group, we've been working in the Canadian Arctic for quite a while. So I think my first trip to the proper Arctic above tree line for my research was in around 2008. And then I got established in my position at the University of Edinburgh in 2013. And we, for a while, were going to the tundra each year. Then the pandemic hit. So there's been a little gap in our field studies in this Arctic site in particular, but things seem to be in a state where we will be able to return with a full team this summer. So we're really excited to get back because we've built up these monitoring data sets where we were observing change year by year. And now we've had a little bit of a gap, and it'll be really interesting to see where those data sets are at.
Is it difficult, do you think, to distinguish the signal from what might have happened during the pandemic? Because during the pandemic, a lot of traffic, for instance, came to a standstill as people were in lockdown, etc. Would you expect any changes to be visible or measurable from that?
It's a great question. So I think in many ecosystems, particularly, say, national parks or places in close to more urban proximity, they really noticed a big difference in the people visiting those sites. And so wildlife became roaming more freely, shall we say, and there were less sort of direct human impacts. There's people studying the impact of just like plain noise on, say, birdsong. And so in the more densely populated areas, you could see very dramatic impacts. In the Arctic, it's sort of interesting because I think the direct human impacts are lower. Probably not the case that we would detect a sort of pandemic response up there from less air traffic or less air pollution, et cetera, just because those impacts are quite diffuse in that system. But us as researchers weren't there, and we create an impact on those environments as we hike out to the sites every day as we do our research. So in some ways, it's been, I think, nice for our field sites to have a break from us. I should say that though we haven't been there as researchers coming from University of Edinburgh or elsewhere in the world, the local Arctic peoples are still there, and they are continuing monitoring when the rest of us can't get there, and their observations of change were not as impacted by the pandemic. So for people who are local to these sites, the work can continue. And that's true at sites around the world. A lot of the sort of academic research slowed down, but that didn't mean there weren't observations of change. And of course, the satellites were still observing things. So I think part of it is about piecing together the on-the-ground data we didn't collect with the continuing data collection.
Yeah, I would like to change the questions a little bit and go more into the technical aspects. We're talking about collecting data by various different means. So there's drones, there's satellites. How do you bring all of that together?
For most of my career, I've been really interested in how we can get a better understanding of larger system by bringing different observations together. So I think I got excited about that first during my PhD with that shrubbering work that I was doing and realizing that other people were collecting similar data sets. And I really wanted to get us all to bring our data sets together to form a bigger understanding. So that was the first data synthesis I tackled. Then we've been doing the drone data synthesis work and various different elements to it. And each time it's different collaborators and different types of data. Always there are challenges that come into play. So I think the main generic challenges is, first of all, getting the team together and finding the right people. And one of the things I'm quite aware of is it's sort of you start with your own networks, and that means that you may not be fully inclusive because you don't know that someone else is also collecting similar data. So we've really tried over the years to send many emails, put out tweets, say the project that we're working on, and encourage people to get in touch with us if they have relevant data. And then you form that team. And then the next challenge is people who are very keen to participate to actually get the data off of them. So we're all very busy people, and putting together a data set for someone else to be able to analyze and understand is a lot of work. Then you have the data, and then there's the good old data cleaning phase, which is, I've seen some statistics like 80 to 90% of data synthesis type person is doing with their time. Huge amount of effort. So you have the human error, people writing down the wrong numbers. You have measurement error, so people think it's in unit X, but they've actually reported unit Y. You have different taxonomical variations. So someone at one site calls the same species one thing, and the next site they call it another thing. There's like spelling mistakes through the data. There's, all those problems. And a lot of them you don't know to expect them. The geographic coordinates being like inverted or having different precision on them, so you can't exactly tell where that plot was found. You go through over time, I guess, a bunch of sort of rules that you set up and try to find these errors that are inherent in these data sets and deal with them. But a lot of that time, it's about making arbitrary decisions about, okay, I don't have the really precise information, so I'm going to assume that this plot is not in the middle of this lake because it says it's plants, and I'm going to move it. Those decision-making stages can be really stressful, I think, for the person leading the analysis, because you don't want to add error into these data sets, but ultimately you have to do something and document that. So we tried really hard, and I've learned the hard way over time to really document all the changes you make to the raw data that was given to you. And over time, we've tried to do it more and more with code, and with that cleaning code, staying with the analysis ending up in the final repository so that anyone else can go back to any stage and make different arbitrary decisions. Okay, so that's just the cleaning. So we haven't even done any science yet. Then just getting together and coming up with research questions, hypotheses, deciding on how we're going to analyze these very complex hierarchical data sets, and then getting through that whole process. And then the final stage is trying to make every part of the process open and available so that someone can continue that work in future. So the whole process, I think, takes far more time than the science itself. And of course, there's no real incentives as an academic scientist to put all this extra effort in, apart from knowing that hopefully that work that you do not only helps to answer your questions right now, but might facilitate really cool research in the future.
That's a nice segue into my next question, really, or comment perhaps, or a combination of the two. The work that you do and what you just described involves knowledge, not just the expertise in your field, but also quite a lot of in-depth technical knowledge, right? How you deal with data cleaning, data storage, data processing and analysis, which also involves probably software and, in terms of drones, also some kind of hardware experience. How do you get all of that? How did the training that you received at uni prepare you for all of that?
Not terribly well, I would say, from the training from. So I'm thinking back. My first experience with computer programming might have been very, very briefly in high school. And at that time, I said, this is not for me, and just left it behind. And then I went through my university years and tried to avoid all quantitative subjects. And then when I got to my master's, I wanted to work in northern ecosystems, and I got a master's project at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. So I'm off in Fairbanks, Alaska, and one of my co-supervisors was an ecosystem modeler, so in a pretty quantitative lab. And he's like, Isla, you need to take some programming. And he urged me to sign up for this computer science course where we were learning C++. And for some reason, the instructor was unable to teach the first half of the course, and a professional programmer came in and taught us programming, not in an academic context, but just so you want to work in the world of software development. And it was sort of eye-opening because I learned that this programming is fun, that it can be really like problem-solving based, and it can be very teamwork based. And those were all things that I really enjoyed, working with a team. I did really well in the first half of the course, and I was like, I've discovered my new thing. The second half of the course went back to being an academic theory of programming course, and my marks dropped, and I was not a happy camper anymore. So I put it aside and was like, maybe it's not my thing. Then I started my PhD and started to realize that I wanted to bring data sets together, and that would involve some amount of computer programming and statistical analysis, and I just didn't have the tools in place, and I had a little mid-PhD crisis about that, and then started to teach myself with help of various friends and colleagues, and felt for a long time that I was really behind in terms of my skill sets and trying to catch up. Then one day I sort of realized that I actually had caught up, and I just hadn't noticed that I was on the more quantitative end of economists. Yeah. So now a lot of my job is teaching, training early career researchers themselves, and so I have made this effort to try and not have them go through that experience of feeling like you're failing at acquiring these tools and feeling like you're behind, and trying to set up people for success and starting their careers off with the feeling of enjoying these different tools like programming and statistics, and feeling they have confidence with the tool sets that they have, but also knowing that it's a sort of lifelong journey. You can't go to university for 4 years and have all the tools in place.
And I appreciate you saying that university can't equip you with all the tools that you ever will need. But nowadays you could argue that, well, software development, or let's say IT technologies in general, are such commonplace in science, you can't probably do science without them. And yet we don't really have a recognition for it.
Yeah.
How do you think you would change that? I mean, you say you teach people in C++ possibly, or was it R? Or
it left C++ behind. Mostly, we did, work in R in our lab, and a bit of Python. Yeah, R is our home language, shall we say.
Yeah, but I mean, how would you change that lack of recognition? The fact that we do need software, and yet we're not actually getting any software skills unless I actually take a course myself.
Yeah, big question. Let's see. Where would I start? I think one of the places to start is to think of programming. So we tend to think of programming as a quantitative skill. I think I even used that wording earlier in this conversation, but it's really more of let's call it a literacy skill or something. So to learn how to program, you don't need to know complex algebra or anything else. You can teach a child to program. So bringing that training in on some of those computer skills much, much, much earlier. And maybe we should have programming as a required course in first year university for any science discipline, for example. And hopefully across the years of any scientific discipline, students would be like, theoretically, they're learning how to write or give an oral presentation. They would be learning how to code at the same time. It's just having it as more of a basic skill set. And then that takes away some of the fear factor, because I think a lot of us, particularly in disciplines like ecology, that's been sort of known as a soft science in the past, tend to think, I don't need quantitative skills to go into this career, which I think is the wrong assumption in the current day. You do need quantitative skills to go into ecology for, and if you go through your degree and don't engage with any of those skills, you aren't very employable at the end. So bringing the skill sets in and just being like, this is like the basic assumption is you should have these skills in place. And separating them out from mathematical skills and statistical skills, which are a different skill set, arguably. So that's one element to things. I talked a bit about like increasing people's confidence with developing all these different skill sets, including the quantitative skills like mathematics and statistics, trying to make sure that the reason people aren't engaging is not because they're intimidated. If they choose to not engage, it should be because they genuinely find those things boring. That's fine. They're not doing it.
That does happen, yeah.
Because they're afraid that they're going to fail or they're afraid that they won't be good enough. That's a problem. Often they're totally wrong about that. And often it's people who have a lot of fear. If they can get over that fear, they learn that this is something they're actually really good at. So I worry in a lot of fields that we are losing the really bright people because of these early decisions of that. Seems intimidating to me, therefore I won't engage with that. Back to like the rewards, I guess, the carrots for putting this effort in. Just thinking more broadly about open science in general. So there's been this publish or perish paradigm in academia, and it's still absolutely there. But I think one of the easy fixes is you just, and which is happening, I think. So you say you have to make your data available when you publish a study, and you have to make your code available when you publish a study, and you should make the paper itself, but also the data and the code open and accessible. And then you could have a publish and data set and code or perish paradigm, where instead of just counting the papers, you could count the papers and the data sets of the code repositories. And that would create an easy, it's not the perfect system, but it's an easy switch. And I think to some extent that's happening, but we need to make sure that that's a part of all of the stages. So it's not just whether you get promoted, but it's also about whether you get future funding based on how you treated the data and the code and the whole process from previous funding. That helps. But at the same time, then the expectation has to decrease for the amount of papers you're going to publish, because to do the whole open science thing, from making protocols available through to making your data and code available, it takes way more time.
We've come to the end now, and I really would like to thank you for this exciting interview, and all the best for the tundra research, the drone research, and the SSI fellowship.
Great. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.